Okay, well, welcome everyone. Distinguished guests and Mr. Drummy and others. I want to welcome you all to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts for our December stated meeting. And our guest today is Mark Peterson, who has been a member of the Society since 1996. After he finished his graduate work at Harvard, he went to the University of Iowa, where he was a professor. In fact, he sent one of his Iowa students here as a graduate student forum fellow back in actually the first decade or so of this century. And then he went off to Berkeley. He taught at the University of California, Berkeley. In fact, he even chaired their history department for a couple of years before coming here to Yale. Actually a well-known school south of Boston in New Haven, where he's been teaching since...
West, really,
yes,
yeah.
2018. His first book was The Price of Redemption, The Spiritual Economy of Puritan New England, which appeared in 1997. I think it was about that time that he began editing the papers of John Hull, the New England, the Boston mint master, and I know the Publications Committee and the Colonial Society are still eagerly awaiting that manuscript. And
it's a very big project.
It's a big project, yes. And it takes a big man to finish it. His subsequent book was The City-State of Boston, The Rise and Fall of an Atlantic Power, 1630-1865, which is really a magisterial history of Boston told in a way you don't anticipate a history of Boston being told. And I would invite people to go look at the copy that is in our collection of books by Colonial Society members, but that copy always disappears after one of our open houses. I think it probably is the most frequently stolen book from our collections. And he is now working on a kind of a combined project looking at the American Revolution. The second volume of this is Revolution's End, A History of the American Revolution for the 21st Century. But the book he's going to be talking to us about today is coming out in March, The Making and Breaking of, actually, the Long Crisis. The Making and Breaking of the American Constitution is part of his series on the long crisis of the Constitution. So I want to welcome my good friend and colleague Mark Peterson to tell us about the making and breaking of the American Constitution, and I hope that we recover our video so that you can accompany your talk. Right now the screen is blank.
Oh, okay.
So welcome all to the Colonial Society. Here we go, the making and breaking of the American Constitution. Please welcome Mark Peterson.
All right. Thank you very much, Bob, for that curious introduction. And thank you all for coming out on what turned out to be quite a beautiful Thursday afternoon here in the city-state of Boston. It's great to be back here, too, and to see many familiar faces in the room as well. For both of those first two books, we had some kind of party or launching event here of one kind or another. Bob. And I consider this something of a third. So this is the book. It's coming out on March 10th, and from Princeton University Press. And in fact, this week I have been enjoying the, for me, quite new experience of recording the audio book for it myself. I have been singing into a can in a studio down at Sterling Library in Yale every morning this week, and I have 2 more to go. Which means that should you choose, and if you have a few extra dollars come March 10th, you too can experience the unbridled thrill of listening to me read this book aloud. So try stealing that one. So as you can probably see from the title, The Making and Breaking of the American Constitution, a 1,000-year history. I'm trying to cover a lot of ground in this book, which means that it would not be an easy task for me to kind of, run the table from beginning to end. The first of those 1,000 years is really the year 1086, when William the Conqueror organizes the creation of the Doomsday Book. That is the huge survey, rate book of every piece of property, every estate in all of the England that he and his knights from Normandy had conquered 2 decades before. I'm treating that as in many ways the first and massive constitutional document in the Anglo-American constitutional history that this book is about. And the story goes, well, really up to the present, and in some scary pages in the epilogue, even speculates a bit about the next 65 years or so of our current century, which would take the story up to around 2086. Right. So the book is in 12 chapters. It doesn't try to cover all of that equally in chronological terms. It moves pretty rapidly to the period of the American Revolution and the making of new American constitutions, what I call the Great Realignment. And in fact, this is the first public talk I've given about this book. In the past, in my other books, I had done lots of these, but in part because this was very much a COVID project. I started researching and working through the material then, and the way COVID cut back on travel, the difficulty of getting to archives and the like. I really kind of hunkered down and wrote this book first for myself and now for a wider audience. And so what I'd like to do today is, rather than try to take you through the whole whirlwind tour of it, kind of bend the argument that I'm making around, as I'm suggesting in the title here, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, since I am assuming that this audience, above any and all other audiences, will know some of the history of colonial Massachusetts. So I can show you what I want to do with that material, with the constitutional history of Massachusetts, mainly under its first charter, as a way to show you how I'm thinking about American constitutionalism more generally. And then from there, kind of launch into a few sort of teasers about where the book takes us in the 2+ centuries from Philadelphia in 1787 to more or less nowadays. Now I have to do this to make it go forward. Yes. So this may be an unfamiliar person, but he's important to the way that I begin the book and that I want to think about our subject for today. Because one of the main interventions I'm trying to make in this book is to encourage contemporary readers to rethink what constitutions are, what constitutionalism is. One of the products of 20th century and now 21st century constitutionalism, I think a rather unfortunate product of it, is the way a lot of modern thinking about the Constitution has become the preserve of lawyers, of judges, of courtroom kinds of historical work, which really wasn't necessarily the case, certainly not through the long stretch of Anglo-American history. And what I'm really trying to encourage is that we think about constitutions not just as a written text, as words on a page, but rather something much broader, something much more connected to the long history of constitutionalism, which is as a kind of relationship between people, a society, the land they live on, the frame of government that they develop for themselves, to rule themselves, and lastly, and not always necessarily, written instruments, and I use the plural deliberately in one way or another, to delineate, frame, limit, explain aspects of this relationship, but by no means is or ever could be a written document the entirety of the constitution of a people. So Sir Thomas Smith was a courtier in Edwardian and Elizabethan England in the 16th century. That is a later, somewhat imaginary portrait of him on the right. But the book that he wrote, and that's quite important for me as I begin the story, was called De Republica Anglorum, which he wrote in the 1560s when he was in the service of the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth, It wasn't actually published until after he died. It was posthumous in 1583. But there's the title page of a later edition on the right, De Republica Anglorum, the Commonwealth of England, in which Thomas Smith lays out his vision of constitutions more generally and of the English Constitution in particular. Oops. Sorry, I was looking at my own screen where I had advanced these pictures, but not yours. Okay. So Thomas Smith argues in this book for an important concept, for the idea that a frame of government should suit the society that it governs. For instance, he suggests that the mutations and changes of fashions of government in commonwealths be natural and do not always come of ambition or malice. Now, as someone born in the early 16th century, he had actually lived through quite a lot of ambition and malice and the way those things changed governments, right? He had grown up in the world of Henry VIII, had served under Henry's son Edward, had to kind of lie low during Queen Mary's reign, and then returned to circles of power under Elizabeth. But he sees in the English Commonwealth different aspects of government. Yes, monarchical elements, but also oligarchic, aristocratic elements, and democratic ones as well in the House of Commons. And he's trying to think about and talk about how governments change and what it means to talk about their constitutions. And he puts it this way, that is, because societies differ, right, and he's talking generally about European society at the time, differ according to the nature of the people, so the Commonwealth is to it fit and proper. And the kind of thing he means, and talks about at greater length, is the fact that, well, you know, in European society at the time, there are commercial cities, trading cities, city-states, in which the merchants, artisans, etc. need one form of government, versus, say, the great kingdom of France, an agricultural and absolute-ish monarchy for which the government of a city-state would by no means be fit or suitable. And so he concludes this little section of his discussion by an analogy to make his point in a vivid way. He says, the Commonwealth is to fit the people like a garment to the body, or a shoe to the foot. Then the body is in quiet and findeth ease, pleasure, and profit. But if a contrary form be given to a contrary manner of people, as when the shoe is too little or too great for the foot, it doth hurt and encumber the convenient use thereof. And so I bring up Thomas Smith, and I use him in the introduction of this book to suggest how deeply embedded in the early modern world the idea was that constitutions are relationships, that they're relationships between, it's hard to have to change them both at once, between, on the one hand, the body of the Commonwealth, that is, the land and the people who occupy the place that the government is framed for. And then second, to think about what the garment is, well, especially in Smith's terms, but as we'll see elsewhere as well, he means both the frame of government and written instruments that help to define that. So by frame of government, that includes things like the existing institutions, the Crown, the House of Lords, the House of Commons, the common law, the courts throughout the land, the rituals and practices by which government takes place. And then there are also written instruments that are part of this constitutional garment. So by the time Smith was writing, well, there are the various statutes that had transformed England from part of the Roman Catholic Church to an independent church. The Parliament had passed the Book of Common Prayer that gave an official status to it. Other statutes had made the monarch head of the church. But it also went back to Magna Carta and other documents along the way that were written instruments that are involved in creating this garment. So there's this sort of shibboleth that people say again and again that, well, the difference between the United States and Britain is that the United States has a written constitution and Britain does not. Well, that's nonsense, right? The British Constitution has all kinds of written documents that are part of it. And the United States has all kinds of parts of frame of government, the body, that are not in the written Constitution. Just to give you a quick example before I move on. You can read the Philadelphia Constitution, forwards, backwards, inside and out, every amendment, and never really find out what a state is. Right? They existed independently and autonomously before Philadelphia. They were, in an important sense, what came together and created it. Right? And without states, the United States of America makes no sense whatsoever. Right? They're fundamental to the Constitution. They're not in it. Right? They're not part of the written. I mean, they're talked about in it, but they are their own things. Right? So that distinction, I mean, there are degrees in which the U.S. may be more one way and Britain the other, but that distinction is a false one. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is bring back the significance of the understanding of this relationship between the body and the garment as what the Constitution is in order to be able to think about it more effectively. And the reason that I think this is a legitimate enterprise and something that's well worth doing is the fact that the framers of American constitutions, the state constitutions, the Articles of Confederation, the documents that reform it before Philadelphia, like the land ordinances and the like, and then finally, but not finally, the U.S. Constitution, because amendments, etc. The framers were obsessed with getting these relationships right, with making sure that the body and the garment fit one another. How do we know this? Well, the entire constitutional history of the Revolution is about American colonists complaining ever more stridently and then eventually rebelling based on the idea that the revered British Constitution, which every Briton loved and cherished throughout the 18th century, had not been adapted sufficiently to account for North American colonies that had a century earlier been insignificant specks in the British Empire, but had now become a quarter of the realm, huge consumers of the goods that Britain produced, huge producers of the goods that Britain consumed, military powers that helped the crown succeed in its wars, but whose relationship to the crown's and parliament's constitutional structure had never really been resolved perfectly. So that there are constitutional questions that both sides of the transatlantic divide agree are important, and both sides insist that they're right, but they cannot be resolved under the British Constitution of the time. And again, colonists say, we can't be ruled by that small island. We can't be ruled by that parliament because they don't know our interests, they don't know who we are, they don't have our best interests at heart. So with the rebellion, the very first thing that the new now states that are supposedly independent from the crown do is to sit down and think, well, what are we, right? And to create individual constitutions for each state that will be suitable, will fit each state as they go along. And so now is when I want to stop. What have I got there? Okay, I talked about that a little bit already. Sorry, this is... Yes, state constitutions, good. The Articles of Confederation and their reform. In other words, at every stage along the way, through the crisis in the state constitution making, in the making of the Articles, in the fighting over them for a decade or so afterwards, and in finally a convention which does a kind of dramatic reform of the Articles, all of the time they're talking about this problem. How do we figure out frames of government that will fit who we are? This was absolutely vital to that process. So the thing that I find interesting, and especially for this group, and that I wanted to talk about next, is this. Is the way that Massachusetts and its constitutional history is really interesting in this regard. Because from the time of the charter in 1629 to the colonists coming over here, on through the first charter period, and in many ways in the second one as well, this working to make the garment fit the body is exactly what Massachusetts is doing throughout. In other words, there was great experience in this. I tossed these up here in part to emphasize how important this was during the Continental Congress, the time leading up to the Declaration of Independence. On the left, I'm sure you will recognize, is our friend John Adams from just down the street here. On the right is his frenemy, Carter Braxton, another member of the Continental Congress. I think the thing they shared most is that they must have had the same peruke dresser, right? They somehow came up with the same wig style. But beyond that, there was very little they agreed on. How do we know this? Because in the months leading up to the Declaration of Independence, a lot of the other delegates knew that John Adams had spent a tremendous amount of time reading constitutional history. He thought about this a lot. And so in correspondence, they were asking him, well, what should we do? If we're going to make new states, what should their constitutions be like? So Adams wrote up his thoughts and eventually published it anonymously in a pamphlet called Thoughts on Government, in which he said basically, well, they should be just like the Constitution of Massachusetts under the first charter, right? Or Connecticut as it still was, because Connecticut didn't have a royal governor. Well, that's fine, and it circulates, but Carter Braxton was from Virginia. He was the grandson of Robert King Carter, who owned, 2,000 slaves or something like that, one of the richest Virginians. And Carter Braxton, who was quite a foot-dragger in the Continental Congress, was not all that keen on independence, was not sure about all of this rebellion, writes a pamphlet in response in which he says essentially, well, that may be fine for people who live in the frigid north and can grow like cabbages. But for people who live in a rich country like Virginia, where you can make huge profits, this is not a constitution that we want down here. We do not want its egalitarianism. We do not want the degree of representation it has. We do not need town meetings, any of that kind of stuff. He has a very oligarchic constitution in mind, right? So this is precisely what I mean. The different states during this process are thinking, well, if we're going to rule ourselves, our constitution should suit us. And Virginians sure as hell don't want a Massachusetts constitution, right? So, let's just stop and think a little bit about the Massachusetts Bay Company as an experiment in fitting the garment to the body. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I am pretty sure this audience knows this stuff fairly well. We can all, if you want to have questions or whatever, I'm happy to answer any and all afterwards. So in the early days of English colonization making, as the turn towards the corporate charter becomes the new way of funding and organizing colonies, Massachusetts joins that trend. But these charters, since they were drawn from the earlier history of creating overseas trading companies like the East India or the Muscovy Company, and even to some extent universities or cities in British history, they have a kind of one-size-fits-all quality. The king gives a grant to the people who are forming the company. The grant lays out the rules. Away you go, right? What Massachusetts does, and again, this is probably not going to be news to most of you here, is to immediately start adapting the garment, the charter they were given, to fit the body of the society that they were setting about creating. So, famous, stories in Massachusetts history. The location. We don't know the answer to this, but somehow they get their charter not to specify where the board would meet. All of the other ones had tended to say London or Plymouth in England and that sort of thing. The Massachusetts charter doesn't say, so they take it with them to Massachusetts and have their board meetings here, in part so that the Crown cannot mess with them while they're doing it. Immediately, Winthrop goes about expanding the freemanship from the specific named people in the charter who were investors in it to basically all male heads of household who were willing to cross the Atlantic and invest themselves in the project. So the nature of its governance is changing right away. And as they do that, they change the governing council of the company into something that Winthrop himself, I think in 1634, refers to in the nature of a parliament, because they start encouraging the towns as they're spreading out to send some of those freemen to the meetings to vote to represent for the people back. So, right, they're changing the frame of government. They create this system of corporate townships where the colony grants land to the towns who then can sub-distribute it, which is totally not in the charter, right? And totally not the way any English company had ever worked before. But it's what they want, right? Why do they want it? Well, in part because they want to create a particular kind of ecclesiastical establishment and knit them together. They insist every town have a church, every church have a town, and that they work together to fund both institutions, right? They have a different vision of the church than the English one, and so they're going to make it happen. They generate all kinds of fiscal powers that were well beyond their capacity. I talk about this in City State. Their crazily, traitorous coinage of silver coins that John Hull makes. Who is that John Hull? Starting in 1652. And then lastly, even though the charter confines them to a territory from 3 miles north of the Merrimack to 3 miles south of the Charles, they start expanding. They hive off colonies in Connecticut. They eventually get Maine under their control. They're not abiding by the frame of government that they're given. They're modifying it to make the kind of society they want. So, do I have any more here? Yes. Now, the abiding law behind this, and this is a quotation directly from this charter and from every other one of these charters, corporate, colonial, whatever, was that they could, the possessors of the charter could make their own laws and ordinances and whatever they needed, so as such laws and ordinances be not contrary or repugnant to the laws and statutes of this our realm of England. And the problem is nobody really knows what that means. No one knows what it is to be, contrary, I guess you could say. But they defend their churches by saying, well, our churches also follow the Westminster Confession of Faith, just like the Church of England does. And you guys haven't sent over any bishops or anything like that, so we can't ordain Anglican clergymen. All we can do is create our crummy little college and hope that the boys learn enough so that they can stand in front of their towns and do a little bit of preaching, right? What's wrong with that? That's not contrary to the laws of England. It's certainly not repugnant to the laws of England to be teaching Christianity to the people and to the natives as well. So you see what I mean, right? The whole process of the development of early Massachusetts was an extended experiment in the capacity of taking a written document, a written instrument of constitutional government, and adapting it to suit the body of the society that they were making. Of course, the reason that it works is they're 3,000 miles away. It's very hard for the Crown to mess with them in any particular ways. The Crown finally gets around to it at the end of the 17th century and remakes it some. But even beyond that, it's not like that tussle stops. There are all kinds of ways in which Massachusetts continues to try to adapt. And I won't take up any more time to go into that. I'm sure in this anniversary year we'll be hearing a lot more about that. But I put it out there to give you a sense of the centrality of this kind of thinking about the relationship between governing instruments and the society that it's meant to govern as the deep backdrop to the making of American constitutions. Now, gosh, where do I go from here? Okay. So to sort of move towards something of a conclusion here, with my entire book still to discuss. What I want to do is, in a sense, talk about how I'm thinking about the making and also the unmaking or the breaking of the U.S. Constitution as a version of the kind of process that I've been talking about already, but, of course, and of necessity, on a much larger scale. Right, on a scale that initially has to encompass these 13 extraordinarily different colonies, and over the next couple of centuries has to somehow stretch and adapt to deal with the largest enterprise in human history. That is, there has never been a bigger organization that's employed more people and brought in more money and spent more money than the United States government as it became by the latter parts of the 20th century. So to think about this, it's not an explicit part of the book, but one thing that's going on is that I'm trying to think both about the practical challenges of constitution. That is, what is it that these 13 states in the 1780s really felt like they needed to do in order to make a government among and over all of the states work well enough and fit well enough to solve the problems that they had and not like descend into civil conflict among them or collapse into pieces. And so I want to talk about those just for a minute or two here. Sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. So the question is really, can this be done? That is, can one be made out of the many, given the extraordinary inequality and variation among the states? I mean, Pennsylvania had, 30 times as much land as Rhode Island, and Virginia had 12 times as many people as Delaware, right? That no one trying to create an egalitarian republic of states would ever have designed the states to be so different from each other, right? And so this is, on one level, the practical challenge that the Constitution is trying to deal with. Population and land, that variation is, of course, central to this, but there are actually many others. Again, these will not be unfamiliar to you. Race and slavery, a huge divide, right? From Maryland southward, more than a third of the population are enslaved Africans. By the time we get to 1787, Massachusetts has already ended slavery entirely. It practically didn't exist in New Hampshire to begin with, right? These are just radically different societies as far as race and slavery go. Religious establishments, right? New England has one set. The Church of England is in a few other colonies. Other colonies have none whatsoever. These were fundamental aspects of every European government from time immemorial, right? The idea, the practical challenge of making a single union out of these is a huge problem. I'll just refer you to the argument between John Adams and Carter Braxton to say they have very different ideas about what the powers of government would be. If you all know Robin Einhorn's beautiful book called American Taxation, American Slavery, she lays out the huge difference between the ways in which Northerners, New Englanders, and Southerners were willing to even think about how they would tax themselves, right? Because planters did not want the value of all of their goods, their people, their estates, etc., being enumerated by a popular tax regime, whereas New Englanders were totally fine with that, right? Representation and taxation, right? All of these are horribly fraught issues that they really have to fight and struggle and compromise to work out a way in the 1780s to make them come together enough to get consensus among the states around it. But there's one thing which was a huge challenge of the United States in the 1780s that they didn't have to fight about much because there was generally universal agreement across the states. And that was this. And here I want to bring you all back to the memory of my beloved and Susan's beloved advisor, Chris. Where did he go? He's hiding. Okay, to Bernard Bailyn's work, right? Who in Voyagers to the West in 1986 demonstrated the massive growth of British North American population from his study of the emigration records of the time, but in his other book of that year, showing the waves of population coming to America. Between the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763 and the writing of the Constitution in 1787, the British North American population, the U.S. population, doubles in less than 25 years, from 2 million to 4 million people. And then secondly, as a, in many ways, surprising, what do we got here? Surprising outcome of the Treaty of Paris in 1782-83, the initial proposal that the French had made to end the Revolutionary War had suggested that the United States would stop at the Appalachians. That's as far as the U.S. political control would go. Britain would keep Quebec north of the Ohio River, and this huge territory, as big almost as the actual United States, would become an Indian reserve that Spain, to its south in the Floridas, would guarantee. That's how the French wanted the war to end. The American diplomats would not accept that, John Jay, etc., because they knew, A, that line had been an immense cause of the Revolutionary War, the proclamation line of 1763 that prevented American colonists and land speculators, George Washington, from getting their hands on land in the Trans-Appalachian West. And so America makes a separate peace with Britain, and instead Britain grants the United States this mess, right? Which, in addition to giving the U.S. title to land across the Appalachians all the way to the Mississippi, exacerbates the grotesque inequality among the states, right? Look at Virginia there. Look at Georgia. Look at the Carolinas compared to our Connecticuts and Massachusetts. Well, Massachusetts actually has a pretty big chunk into the west as well. But this is the situation in the 1780s that the states are trying to make sense of. And so that combination, the knowledge of this exploding population, and by exploding I mean like unprecedented in world history kind of population growth, together with the claims to that land, makes American leaders, whether it's the diplomats in Paris or the people revising and rewriting the Constitution in the 1780s, make them know that the critical challenge of the United States going forward is to be able to get control over this land, right? The British Empire arguably had collapsed over North America because Britain couldn't gain control over that land. They had tried various methods, and all of them had just exacerbated the conflict. But now the challenge was even greater because this population is growing so fast, right? It's twice as big as it was at the end of the 7 Years' War. And these people are pushing into that territory. So the thing that all of the delegates at Philadelphia and also the members of the Continental Congress in the years before it, who had created the land ordinances and the Northwest Ordinance, the thing they knew was that the national government had to be empowered to make this happen. And the thing that the Constitution does that the land ordinances hadn't done, the land ordinances had made a plan, right, a really interesting idea about selling land, about how you make states. But the U.S. government under the Articles had nothing like the power to make that happen, right? Literally, the surveyors who had been sent out into the Ohio country to carry out the plans of the land ordinance of 1785 had been driven away by indigenous people refusing to let this happen. They knew what was coming. So what the Constitution does is to empower a national government with a presidency, an executive branch with military power, and a Congress that can raise money for armies in peacetime, and a set of courts over the entire national domain. And on that, they build a process whereby the United States can and will do this job. So let me see if I can wrap this story up as quickly as I possibly can. So the practical challenges were solved by these land ordinances and by the Constitution, creating a national state power oriented towards the West and towards transforming Indian land, Indian-owned, occupied, farmed land, into real estate for American colonists, white colonists, to buy. So all of that is done by the Constitution, and much of the story of the 19th century in the U.S. government is the carrying out of that project, which they do with unbelievable speed and efficiency. But what I want to add to it is the conceptual challenges of U.S. constitutionalism, especially in the 19th century, and how to think about the problems it creates for the future development of American constitutionalism. So what they're trying to do at Philadelphia, what they had been trying to do under the Articles as well, was on the one hand to create a constitutional framework for the body of society that would be stable and permanent. But the problem is that they were facing the expectation of rapid change. And it's important to realize how significant the late 18th into the early 19th century was as a moment in how really the world is changing at this time. I have some graphs in the book that spell this out a bit at the end. And this is why this 1,000-year time frame is really worth keeping in mind. From roughly the year 1000 to the year 1800, world population is a kind of steady state thing. So is global GDP. I mean, these measures are tricky to come up with, but these are fairly steady. So is human lifespan. So is atmospheric carbon. You know, all of these things for century upon century had been in a world of relative stasis. I mean, yes, it bounces up and down. You have a Black Death here, you have growth there, right? But these levels go like this until around 1800, when the hockey stick starts coming and then shooting up and up, right? And in British North America, you could already see that starting to happen in the 18th century. Benjamin Franklin saw it. He wrote about it in the 1750s, right? He predicted in 1750 that since American population seemed to be doubling every 25 years, that by 1900 it ought to be about 64 million. The US Census of 1890 hit 63-some million, right? That kind of growth, right, from almost nothing in such a short time span, that was something new under the sun, right? That was a change in the way the world operated. I mean, France had been the largest nation in Europe for centuries, and its population hovered around 20 million century after century after century. But this explosive growth from very little to a huge, population over time, the expectation of that rapid change is part of the conceptual challenge of the U.S. Constitution, right? It's like, if we take the garment to the body analogy, it's like having to buy clothes for children, right? You could spend a lot of money on a beautiful garment that fits them, but wait a minute and, there you go again. But that's not what you want in governments, right? In frames of government. And so that I've talked about. So ultimately, all that they can do in 1787 among these highly conflicted colonies is work out a bargain that satisfies everybody then, right? That says, okay, Carolina gets this. We'll postpone the closing of the slave trade. We'll do the 3/5 clause. Big states get the House, small states get the Senate. All of the compromises that you know about are things that are hashed out based on the interests of that moment. But in order to solve one really critical problem for themselves, they actually create another one. So by giving up monarchy and becoming self-governing republic where the people are theoretically sovereign, they had to figure out this problem of how to empower their governments, their legislatures, whether at the state or the national level, to do the will of the sovereign people. This was never a problem in monarchies where the monarch is sovereign. Because if the monarch is doing it, it's the sovereign's will, right? The sovereign holds the tools of power and exercises them. But the people are this other kind of fictive body. Here I'm calling on Ed Morgan's work on this question, right? You can really only assemble the people in the most extraordinary circumstances, right? You can't have, everyone put your hands up, elective democracy in a country of millions spread across thousands of miles, right? And so they come up with a brilliant answer to it, and Massachusetts leads the way, right? Special conventions, where the people send representatives only to make a constitution, and then send it back to the people so that the people can say, yes, that's what we want. Massachusetts does that in 1780. A kind of sneaky version of that is what the Philadelphia Constitution claims to be, right? But that's the theory. But the problem with that is that it actually removes the tools of power from the hands of the sovereign. That's what Richard Tuck, the political scientist, referred to as the problem of the sleeping sovereign. Sure, the people are sovereign in theory, but has anyone ever actually asked you, to tell what you would like the Constitution to be instead of what it is now, right? No, we have this structure so that, the government carries on as if the people are sovereign, but it's extraordinarily difficult for the people actually to speak. And in the U.S. Constitution, they create this amendment process right, which is the theoretical way in which they can do that. But how's that going, really, right? There were 10 in the first year. There have been 17 in the subsequent 246 years or whatever, and there hasn't really been one in 50 years, right? It's extraordinarily difficult to do that. So we're sovereign, yes, but our access to the tools of government are not the kind of sovereign powers that monarchs and the like have. The other conceptual challenge, and again, I encourage you to think about the United States as a very strange country in this regard, was that unlike every other European country at the time in the Westphalian system, oops, I forgot to do this one. And going back to those maps I was showing you, the United States only occupies, with its own citizens, a very small part of the country that it claims to govern. In fact, I think I have, I'll have to go back to that. So at the time of the first census, the United States claims all of this, but its population only lives here, right? And these populations in the lightest colors are 2 to 6 persons per square mile, right? So the vast majority of the country that the United States doesn't belong to the United States. It belongs to Indian people. They have no control over it. None of it is real estate. None of it produces taxes, right? And so what that means is that from the get-go, the United States had the same speculative quality that the colonies themselves had from the beginning, right? They're projects of the future. So even though they want to create stability and permanence, they know they're going into this project with explosive population growth and the necessity of transforming land that isn't part of the United States into it. And so it's this tension between ideals of stability and all of the documents of the time, Articles of Confederation and a League of Friendship and Perpetual Union, right? And the state, they all say that, right? But they can't be if they also want to adjust the body of society to the terms of the Constitution. So just to give you a sense of this, right? Within only 50 years, it becomes that, right? The population swarms across eastern North America. And the really interesting part, of course, is that, right? Because that was not the United States in 1783. That was France. Actually, it was Spain, and then it became France, and then it only became in 1803. And I'm going to conclude on this. I know I'm going on way too long. I want to go back to talk about that process. Talk about Jefferson and Louisiana statehood. Because it encapsulates, in many ways, the problem that I'm talking about throughout the book. So in 1803, Jefferson, his diplomats, kind of surprisingly, are offered by Napoleon's diplomats the entirety of Louisiana, right? Because Napoleon doesn't need it anymore because he failed to bring Haiti back into slavery. He doesn't want this huge territory anymore. Now, all Jefferson and his diplomats at the time thought they wanted was rights to the Mississippi, maybe a little territory west of it, New Orleans, etc. But instead, they get this giant chunk of territory bigger than the United States already was. And, of course, the United States was already bigger than any country in Europe, right? But he is bothered about this right from the beginning, both about the purchase and then, very soon, the idea that Louisiana would become a state, right? Because who lived in Louisiana? Frenchmen, Spaniards, Indians, and their enslaved people. Not anyone, really, from the original 13 United States that had framed the Constitution. Well, what does the Constitution say about admitting states from territory acquired from foreign countries? It doesn't say anything, right? It wasn't contemplated in 1787 as the thing the U.S. could do. Not even the purchase of territories for foreign countries were contemplated. And Jefferson is, of course, something of a constitutional stickler, right? Through the 1790s, he had harangued Alexander Hamilton every time Hamilton wanted to pull the Constitution in the direction of powers that were not named for Congress, like creating a national bank, for instance. right? Jefferson had been so opposed to this. He says, no implied powers. If it's not written, it's not there. So now Jefferson really wants Louisiana. And the only possible way to think about it is either implied powers or an amendment to the Constitution, right? So in his private correspondence in that year, he writes to senators, friends, his attorney general, and says, well, what can we do here? And he says, well, look, first thing to do is not talk about constitutional problems in Congress, right? Try to keep it quiet, right? But if that doesn't work, he says, we really need an amendment. And he makes the same argument that I've been making here, which is what gives me some confidence that I'm onto something, right? He says, look, Louisiana is huge. We have no idea how many people will eventually live there, who they will be, what kind of societies they have. The idea that Congress can just vote to include it as a state, the way they had done with Ohio or whatever, that's crazy, right? He literally says, well, then why not England or France or the Netherlands as a state in the United States, right? And the founders could not have, and he's one of them, right, could not possibly have imagined this as the future direction, right? And he says it's because bringing in a whole new society, people, land, or whatever, it'll shift the balance of power, it will change the nature of the country, it will alter the body, and therefore we have to alter the garment. And he actually writes a draft of what an amendment like that would look like, and he circulates it among his friends. But his friends, who are good party politicians, not that he wasn't too, say essentially the hell with that. We think it's just like Ohio, right? And we're just going to go ahead and do it. And in 1811, that's what they do, right? They get a lot of pushback. They get it from here, from Josiah Quincy here in the congressman from Boston, who in arguments in Congress basically word for word argues exactly what Jefferson had written in his private letters, saying, this is no good. This changes the nature of the country. No one who made that compact in 1787 would have agreed to it. We have to have an amendment. We either have to have unanimity among the original 13 states, or we have to have an amendment to the Constitution to do this. And of course, Quincy and his side are voted down by roughly 2-1, exactly the percentage that it takes to get, Congress to pass an amendment. There was strong opposition, but not enough, right? And what I'm arguing in this book is that this non-event, this amendment that doesn't happen, is arguably the most fundamental change of the American Constitution in all of its history. Because, to quote Jefferson's language and Quincy's language, it takes something that all of that constitutional work, the kind that Massachusetts had done as a colony, the kind that the states do, and then the nation does in the 1770s and 80s, it takes all that work, making it to be the case that the people are sovereign, and they alone have the right to make dramatic changes to the Constitution, and instead usurps that as what Josiah Quincy calls a mere municipal power of Congress. And that's exactly then what happens, right? The entirety of the 19th century involves different parties and factions using that power to push expansion, and through the Civil War, it's the slave states, so that they can build up bigger majorities in Congress, not by having better arguments, not by organizing better as parties, but by conquering foreign territory, making it into states, and therefore getting more votes in the system, right? And so the United States is driven into civil war by the outcome of this non-decision, right? I could go on. After the Civil War, it becomes a Democrat-Republican thing. It's the reason that Congress admits states to the Union that had no business being states. I hope no one's from Nevada here. Is anyone? Does anyone know what the population of Nevada was in the census before it was admitted to statehood? It was about the same as the population of Ypsilanti, Michigan. It had about 6,800 people living in the Nevada territories. It was just remotely not, but the Republican Party wanted it as a state because 3 electoral votes. And this was 1863, and Lincoln was worried about losing, and so they made a state out of Nevada in order to get, right? It went like that, But it completely undermined the basic idea of 1787, that you want a constitution and its institutions and frameworks of government designed to fit the body of the people. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to say, lastly, that we are now at a very late stage of what this project was originally called the long crisis of the Constitution, right? And we are at a very late stage of that, in the sense that what the United States is now, it's 340-some million people. It's unbelievably large and complicated government, has been pulled so far away from what the written instrument that governs it is that the only image I can come up with is like a behemoth in a straitjacket, right? It's just it's just the case. That instrument is not suited to the body of the people and the government that we have. And you know, whatever your politics are, this crisis has been a long time coming, right? That the condition that the United States is a result of the long history of what James Russell Lowell said in 1888 of Americans not paying attention to their constitutional duties, not changing the Constitution in repeated ways to keep it suited to the body of the society and the government that we have. So I will leave you there at that somewhat desperate moment. But that is what this book is about. And so come March, if you're interested in the full version of this story, that's where you'll find it. Thank you so much for letting me talk to you for so long. I'm ready for any and all questions, brickbats, anything you care to throw.
Private lawyers look at positive law from the perspective of if it's not prohibited, you can do it.
Uh-huh. Right.
That's what you're talking about constitutionally. It doesn't sound like they ever stumbled over any prohibitions. They just acted no one said we couldn't. Lots of people can do it.
Right. Except, you know, the head of the party who does it thinks they shouldn't do it, and he just keeps his mouth shut. The chapter in which I tell that story is called "The President Who Failed to Bark," because it's the Sherlock Holmes Silver Blaze incident. What was the curious incident of the dog in the night? The dog did nothing in the night. That was the curious incident. The fact that Jefferson does nothing in the face of, and he goes on for pages in his personal court. I mean, he drafts an amendment. And when it comes up, silence, because it was, the thing he says is, well, we can all hope that, the good sense of the people will solve any problems that might come from this. He says this in 1803. In 1820, when the Missouri crisis comes along, which is exactly the same thing, he says, I heard it with terror like a fire bell in the night. This is the death knell of the Union, right? The good sense didn't work this out, right? And it does get pushback. I mean, really powerful, important. It's not just Quincy. It's Dana, the senator from Connecticut, proposes an amendment like this. It's not that they, the people, no one is saying anything, right? It's just that the Democratic Republicans have the votes, right? Thanks, though, Chris. Yeah. Susan Lively has a question. Yes.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. Again, we can read through the book. I'm wondering how elections fit into your idea of a sleeping sovereign, because it seems to me that would be the counter-argument. Right?
Well, yeah, and elections fit into it in that that's absolutely what the sovereign people have said the government should do. We elect those people, and then what they do are the things we've told them they can do under these constitutions, the powers that they have, right? And so all of these questions emerge outside that realm when it becomes the things that, as Chris is saying, no one told us we couldn't, or this isn't exactly in the Constitution, but it's not exactly not either. And that's why I think it's so important for people to understand that the Constitution can't ever be just a written document. It's all of this other stuff that's out there that are fundamental to the way a society operates. So it's a tension, right? And yes, it's always the case that people say, well, we have the mandate of the people to do this. And I didn't quote this part, but another one of these letters that Jefferson writes to John Breckinridge, the Kentucky senator, It's the most patronizing thing in the world. He's trying to say, well, how can we justify this whole Louisiana thing? And he says, well, okay, we went ahead and did this. We bought the territory without the authorization of the people formally in the Constitution. He calls it an act beyond the Constitution in his own correspondence. And then he says, but it's okay, or we can make it okay. Because think of it this way, it's just as if we were the guardians of wards, and we're doing for them what we know they would have done if they had empowered us to do it. But we had to act fast. We had to make a deal and that sort of thing, right? And then he says, well, and we can prove that it's okay with them if we have an amendment where they, as the people, say, yes, thank you for Louisiana, right? But that language that's the language of monarchy, right? Of treating the people as children that are under the guardianship of under the wardship of the guardians in government. I mean, this is Thomas Jefferson, the supposed, man of the people, great Democrat, writing to his friends saying, yes, well, the little children out there will be happy once we have bought. It's just so alien, right, to the spirit of no matter what side you're on of what this. And so that's the kind of thing I mean, right? That's. I mean, he's in his version, the sleeping sovereign is children who can't really decide this kind of thing for themselves. Right? There was someone over here. Yes.
Thanks. I am trying to resolve in my head what seems like a tension between your definition of a constitution early on, very broadly, including not just the written document, and what seems more at the end of your talk when you're talking about the failure to amend the written Constitution of 1789, a more narrow definition of the Constitution as a written document. What would you say, take abortion as an example, the Supreme Court does Roe versus Wade, and then they do Dobbs, and would you include that as part of the Constitution, low C? Adjusting through a broad Constitution, or do you kind of write those changes out of your later definition of the Constitution?
No, that tension is really important to the last half of the book. We would have been here a long time if I'd gone in that direction. So essentially, when the United States, first as states and then nationally, develop this method for generating a written instrument that speaks the people's sovereignty as separate from what legislatures do, right? That does create, for many people, a narrowing of the idea of what a constitution is, right? It makes possible the eventual idea that, well, the Constitution is just a written document, right? If you trace this, like in the OED, they follow this along exactly, right? That hardly anybody ever uses it in that sort of modern sense in pre-modern times. It becomes more and more prevalent, and it generates the idea that, well, we could just write a constitution for a country that we've conquered or that its government has collapsed or whatever, like the United States does in Iraq in 2003, right? But what I'm trying to say is that this other way of thinking about a constitution never goes away, right? And for instance, that thing I was saying about Britain versus the United States. Well, Britain becomes the world's largest empire in the 19th century without ever sitting down and saying, this is our constitution, right? It has that constitutional structure that is relational in that regard. But you're not wrong. It's certainly the case that in the United States, and especially in the world of the courts and the law, etc., you get this vision of the Constitution as nothing but the words on paper. And that's essentially what originalism is, ultimately, is a claim that that's all we've got, right? And we have to use that as our guide for all things political. And part of how we get there has to do with the politics and governance challenges of the 20th century. right? So early in the 20th century, a lot of people in various forms of power really recognize that the United States Constitution is in trouble and needs to be reworked, right? And that's why we get the Senate, direct election of the Senate Amendment. That's why we get the income tax amendment. That's why we get the 21st Amendment, women's enfranchisement and that sort of thing. People are aware that society has changed, industrialization, urbanization, the old traditional family structures are not what they were in the 18th century, right? And so people are changing it. And really, it's the Depression, World War II, and the Cold War that pushed the United States toward the politics of emergency, right? Where the idea is, it would be so nice to be able to change the Constitution to allow us to do the things we think the government needs to do yesterday. But we can't. We don't have the time for that. And the critical turn here, and this is weird for me, but in this book, two great heroes of American liberal democracy, Jefferson and Franklin Roosevelt, are in a weird way the villains of the story, in that Roosevelt, having won 46 of 48 states in the election of 1936, with 75% majorities in both houses of Congress, and with 3/4 of the governors of the states of the Union Democrats, has the courts striking down, the major, programs of the New Deal, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the NRA, all this kind of stuff, right? He threatens the court packing thing. It leads the justices to start changing their minds. But he gives a fireside chat speech to the whole nation on the radio in which he says, many of my advisors are recommending amendments. They've written them up. It was just like 1803, right? Amendments that will allow the Agricultural Adjustment Act, NRA, all this kind of stuff to go forward, Social Security, etc. But he says, today in the modern age of mass communications and corporate power, and in the way the population of the nation has redistributed itself across the time, he says that only 5% of the population, scattered across 13 states, can defeat any amendment to the Constitution, right? And he's just not going to do it, right? And I can't imagine a time where there would be greater likelihood of getting a substantive amendment to the Constitution. I don't mean just like, can the congressman's salaries be changed during that, that was the last one, right? But really an amendment that, really changed the nature and structure of American government. I can't imagine a better time than that moment, right? Where you have pretty great confidence that you have both houses of Congress and you have 3/4 of the states to ratify it. But basically he says in this world, what he says is any interest group, any corporation can use their money and their tools of communication to block any amendment to the Constitution. So he just won't do it, right? And that's the regime we've been living in ever since, right? And so that's essentially why the Supreme Court has become the arbiter of these kinds of questions. But it's a terrible position for a nation where the people are supposed to be sovereign to be in, right? Where 9 justices who are at the remote end of what Susan was saying about elections, the most distant from direct popular election are the people who are making decisions about whether the people of this country can have the government they want or not, right? So that's where I would leave that question. Have I gone way, way, way over time? Okay, thank you very much.